Welcome back to the Ancient Temples of Luxor, Egypt, part 2 of 2. In this part, I'll cover the temples on the West Bank and those that can be reached in short day trips from the city of Luxor. Let's move across the river from the temples I discussed in part 1 and look at Luxor's West Bank temples. Most of the West Bank temples are mortuary temples. They were dedicated to the kings who built them. Ancient Egyptians called them Hut Net He Renpet, or literally, house for millions of years. Mortuary temples were originally built beside the Old and Middle Kingdom pyramids. They were constructed for the funeral service of the pharaoh and as a place to conduct memorial services in perpetuity to honor the dead king. Mortuary temples included pylons, courts, pillared halls, shrines, and chapels. They also had storerooms for the food that would be offered to the dead king. However, once the New Kingdom pharaohs began hiding their tombs in the secluded Valley of the Kings, they built their mortuary temples separately on Luxor's West Bank. Their burial places in the valley were supposed to be a secret after all. These mortuary temples were constructed like those of the gods, for Pharaoh was a living god and he deserved the best. They had entry avenues of sphinxes, pylons, courtyards, and a shrine dedicated to the deceased king. In the mortuary temple chapel, priests performed daily rituals and presented offerings to the dead king's Ka. The king provided endowments of estates and supplies to mortuary temple priests and staff to ensure that services and offerings would be performed forever and ever. Some of the lesser-known West Bank temples have recently undergone excavation and conservation. For example, the mortuary temple at Tausret by the University of Arizona. Tausret was the last queen and pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. One of our ESS members, Dick Harwood, supervised this dig. Dick spoke about his work at Tausret's temple during his ESS lecture in August of 2018. Now let's look at the better preserved mortuary temples on the West Bank. Deir el-Bahri, Arabic for Northern Monastery, is a complex of temples and tombs located on the West Bank. The site backs onto the steep cliff face that separates Luxor's western side from the Valley of the Kings. The first monument built at this site was the mortuary temple of Montuhotep II of the 11th dynasty. Later, in the 18th dynasty, Hatshepsut and then Thutmose III built temples here. Montuhotep's temple has been excavated and the outline of its second story revealed. Here's a reconstruction of the temple. Scholars disagree on whether the building was topped with a pyramid or a rectangular building. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple was designed and built by Senenmut, her royal steward and architect, and believed by some to be her lover. It's one of the most impressive monuments built by the ancient Egyptians. The temple was named Djeser Djeseru, or Holy of Holies. Each of the 3 levels of Hatshepsut's temple have a double row of square columns. And on the top level, Osiride statues of Hatshepsut once stood in front of each pillar. This is the entrance to the sanctuary located on the top level. Almost 100 feet above the valley floor, it's carved back into the cliff face. The reliefs within Hatshepsut's temple describe her immaculate conception and claim she was actually the daughter of Amun, who seduced her mother by pretending to be the king. This idea is similar to Amenhotep III's claim at Luxor Temple, which I described in the first part. Other texts and pictures in the temple describe an ocean-going expedition to the land of Punt, an exotic country far away on the Red Sea coast. Trading expeditions from Egypt had visited Punt since the reign of Sahure in the 5th dynasty. The land of Punt was a place abundant with ivory, incense, and gold. In this scene, Hatshepsut's men plant incense trees brought from Punt to her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. In front of the temple, the trunks of those trees can still be seen today. Hatshepsut's architect, Senenmut, was also nursemaid to Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferure. If the statue on the left looks familiar, it's probably because it was displayed here in Denver, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, in 2004 in the Quest for Immortality exhibit. Senenmut had 2 tombs on the West Bank. The first, a T-shaped offering chapel designated TT71, was in the Nobles Cemetery at Gurna. The curse in his chapel, and I quote, "Any man who will cause damage to my statue may not be buried in the Western Cemetery," end quote, Well, it does not appear to have worked, as this chapel was deliberately damaged, probably when Hatshepsut fell out of favor. Senenmut's actual burial chamber, TT 353, was hidden under Hatshepsut's courtyard. Although found intact, it does not appear to ever have been used. The ceiling of Senenmut's tomb is decorated with astronomical designs, recording the lunar months, constellations, and planets. Sandwiched in between Hatshepsut and Montuhotep's temples are the ruins of Thutmose III's temple dedicated to Amun. It was buried when the cliff collapsed behind it, and it's currently being excavated. The temple's construction was supervised by Thutmose's vizier, Rekhmire, whose tomb at Gurna has probably been visited by many of you here tonight. Rekhmire's tomb is the one that Dr. Aidan Dodson mentioned at his ESS lecture in March of 2018. It's the tomb with the unusual painting depicting a girl facing away from the viewer. Excavation and conservation of Thutmose III's temple and the Mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut is currently being carried out by a joint Polish and Egyptian team. Some references call Thutmose III's temple at Deir el-Bahri a mortuary temple, but strictly speaking, it's actually a cult temple dedicated to Amun. The ruins of Thutmose III's true mortuary temple are closer to the Nile, just north of the mortuary temple of Ramses II. Seti I was the second king of the 19th dynasty. He was the father of Ramses II. Seti's mortuary temple was begun by him, but it was completed by his son, Ramses II. It's located east of Deir el-Bahri, close to the Nile. It was dedicated to Seti, Amun-Ra, and the cult of Seti's father, Ramses I. Seti's temple originally had two huge pylons and a row of processional sphinxes, but today much of the temple has been lost, and all that remains are the portico, hypostyle hall, storerooms, and sanctuary. In the sanctuary is a shrine dedicated to Seti's father, Ramses I, who only reigned a little under 2 years and did not construct a mortuary temple for himself. Seti I's son, Ramses II, built numerous monuments and had many military victories. His greatest achievement was his huge temple at Abu Simbel in Nubia. In 1829, Champollion first identified Ramses II's West Bank mortuary temple, naming it the Ramesseum. Built with 2 pylons, 2 courtyards, a hypostyle hall, a sanctuary, and a sacred lake, the temple was surrounded with enough storage magazines to hold many, many goodies for Ramses' use in the afterlife. The temple's first pylon is, of course, adorned with scenes of Ramses' military victory at the Battle of Kadesh. The upper part of the second pylon of the Ramesseum shows a procession of ancestors of Ramses II. The 14 ancestor pharaohs are shown on this list. Notably absent, of course, are Hatshepsut and the Amarna period kings. There's a drawing made in 1879 of a wall scene in the Ramesseum showing Ramses attacking a Hittite fortress in Dapur, Syria, drawn in 1879. I mentioned in part 1 of this talk that Ramses also had battle scenes of Dapur on a wall of the Ramses court at Luxor Temple. This is how the storming of the fort scene looks today. Next to the second pylon lies a shattered granite colossal statue. This statue was once the largest ever erected, weighing over 1,000 tons. Originally, it would have stood almost 100 feet high. The statue is most famous today for its inspiration in the poem Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. Ozymandias, by the way, is a Greek corruption of Ramses II's throne name, Uzur Ma'at Ra. It means powerful is the justice of Ra. Notice just how big this statue is. The Ramesseum has suffered from stone quarrying over the millennia, but the portico and hypostyle hall, shown here, are quite well preserved. 27 years after Ramses II died, Ramses III ascended to the throne. He was not related to Ramses II. 31 years later, he was assassinated in the so-called harem conspiracy led by one of his secondary wives. If the penalty for violating the tomb of a dead king was impalement, just imagine what the punishment was for killing the living god. It would have been horrific. Ramses III's mortuary temple is located at Medinet Habu, Arabic for the city of Habu. The name Habu probably came from the ancient Egyptian word for a place to billet troops, Jamu. It would have been an impressive structure when first built. Here's a reconstruction of the eastern gate and high fortified walls. This is how it looks today, large, almost intact, and covered with colorful scenes on its walls. Medinet Habu is one of the best preserved mortuary temples of ancient Egypt. Similar to the King's List of the Ramesseum, Ramses III copied the format of Ramses II's list and modified the cartouches to name 16 of his own ancestors. Scenes at Medinet Habu include reliefs of the defeat of the Sea Peoples. Scholars disagree on who these people may have been, but a likely answer is that the 9 different tribes of Sea Peoples included the early Greeks, Cretians, Sardinians, and Philistines. In this picture, priests carry the bark of the god Amun into the temple of Medinet Habu during the annual Beautiful Feast of the Valley. During this celebration, kings, nobles, and commoners visited the tombs of their ancestors and presented them with an offering feast. Also noteworthy at Medinet Habu are scenes featuring the festivals of Min and Opet, as well as a list of annual festivals celebrated by the ancient Egyptians. Min was an important fertility god who gave the pharaoh power to father children. This scene of Ramses III hunting bulls is on the first pylon. Here's a reconstruction by Floyd Chapman, one of our ESS members. It shows just how spectacular these temples must have looked when they were freshly painted. Some of the reliefs at Medinet Habu do still retain much of their original paint. Here, Ramses III offers water lilies to the goddess Hathor. Located next to the south side of the mortuary temple of Medinet Habu are the remains of Ramses III's palace. The doorway and steps were the king's private access between the palace and mortuary temple. Just south of Medinet Habu is the archaeological site of Malkata. Malkata means in Arabic, the place where things are picked up. At an ESS lecture in September of 2017, Barry Kemp described his work at Malkata. This is an artist's impression of the palace and its ceremonial lake called the Birket Habu. Here's what remains today of the Malkata Palace. It was the home of King Tut's grandparents, Pharaoh Amenhotep III and his wife, Queen T. Just north of the Malkata Palace are the ruins of Amenhotep III's mortuary temple. 2 colossal statues, commonly called the Colossi of Memnon, stand where the temple's entrance once stood. Amenhotep's mortuary temple is currently being excavated under the direction of Dr. Hourig Sarouzian, with a team of 30 specialists and 280 Egyptian workmen. Her project's goal is to unearth and then reposition the buried remains of the temple back to their original positions. Nearby at Deir el-Medina is a temple dedicated to the goddess Hathor and Ma'at. This temple was built and decorated by pharaohs Ptolemy IV, VI, VIII, and XII. Deir el-Medina is an Arabic name meaning monastery of the city. However, the ancient Egyptians called it Set Ma'at, the place of truth. Here's a scene of the weighing of the heart from the temple at Deir el-Medina. Remains of several other temples are located at Deir el-Medina. A temple dedicated to Amenhotep I and his mother, Queen Ahmose, a chapel built by Seti I to honor Hathor, and a temple dedicated to Amun, built by Ramses II. The village next to the temple was the residence of the artisans and workers who built the tombs of the pharaohs in the nearby Valley of the Kings. At his ESS lecture in April 2018, Aidan Dodson mentioned the Deir el-Medina tomb of architect Kha and his wife Merit, who lived in the village. Kha was responsible for building Amenhotep III's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Kha and Merit's intact tomb was discovered in 1906. The contents of their tomb are now on display in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy. The Luxor area is rich in lesser known but very interesting temples. There's a temple at Deir el-Shelwit. To the south are temples at Armant and el-Tod. Further south are the temples of Esna and Edfu, an easy day trip from Luxor. And on the way, be sure to stop at the ancient city of Nekhen. At Deir el-Shelwit, 1 mile south of Malkata, is a Greco-Roman temple dedicated to Isis. All that remains today are the main temple building, foundations of its enclosure wall, and its monumental gate. On the walls of this temple are cartouches of Roman emperors Hadrian, Antinous Pius, Galba, Otho, Vespasian, and Julius Caesar. First examined by Lepsius in the mid-19th century, its interior walls still retain a lot of their original color. The temple at Armant, 12 miles south of Luxor, was dedicated to Montu. Construction began in the Middle Kingdom, and modifications were made in the New Kingdom and late period. Cleopatra VII added a Mamisi and a sacred lake, and dedicated them to her son Caesarion. In Armant, ancient Iuni, Montu was paired with two consorts. One of them was Iunit, a local goddess who first appeared in the reign of Montuhotep III. Her name means she of Iuni. The other consort at Armant was Tenenet. The trio of Montu, Iunet, and Tenenet formed a triad worshipped at Armant. Tenenet was a goddess of beer, brewing, and childbirth. Well, I suppose consuming beer can lead to unexpected pregnancy and childbirth. One of the original party girls, Tenenet inspired the Manchester Marble Brewing Company to name a beer after her. So in a way, I guess she's still worshipped today. Montu's temple survived until the early 20th century, when its stones were used to build a sugar factory. Here's what the excavation looks like today. Associated with the Buchis Bull, the temple at Armant contains statues and scenes of this sacred animal. During the late Ptolemaic and Roman periods, Buchis bulls were mummified and buried in the Bucheum. Nearby, their cow goddess mothers, the Baccaria, were interred in their own catacombs. The Bucheum was excavated in the 1930s by the Egypt Exploration Society, and the site contained Buchis bulls buried in giant sarcophagi, like this one that came from Saqqara. Another temple dedicated to Montu is at el-Tod, 12 miles south of Luxor and just across the river from Armant. The temple was built during the Middle Kingdom, and it's inscribed with the names of Montuhotep II and III and Senusret I. Further additions to the building were made by Ptolemy VIII. 4 chests of gold and silver were discovered here in 1936. These appear to have been made in Anatolia. The treasure was divided, and half is currently in the Louvre Museum in Paris, and half is in the Cairo Museum. At Esna, 36 miles south of Luxor, is the Temple of Khnum. It was built by Ptolemy VI and VIII and Roman emperors Claudius through Decius. The floor of Khnum's temple lies some 30 feet below the modern ground level. Soldiers of the Napoleonic expedition carved their names at the flood debris level just below the capitals. Here's an example drawn on May 8, 1799, by a corporal named Poudre. A relative of one of my ancestors also scratched his name here in the 1840s. Auguste Mariette dug out the centuries of debris in the 1860s. The dwarf god Bes is shown on one of the columns of Esna Temple. Bes was a protector of household, god of music, dance, and sexual pleasure. This scene at Esna is the Roman Emperor Domitian smiting the enemies of Egypt before Khnum and Sekhmet. But 20 miles south of Esna on the western side of the river was the city of Nekhen, also called Hierakonpolis, Greek for Hawk City. In this picture, posts have been added to show the outlines of the buildings. 2 temples were found at Nekhen, a pre-dynastic temple, the oldest found in Egypt, and an Old Kingdom temple. Both temples were dedicated to Horus. In a foundation deposit in the Old Kingdom temple was found the Narmer pallet, the Narmer mace head, the scorpion mace head, the 2 dog pallet, and 2 statues of Khsekamwe, the last king of the 2nd dynasty. Horus was the local deity of Nekhen, called Haru, falcon, in ancient Egyptian. His name was adopted into the Greek as Horus. He was the protector of Egypt. Egyptian legends tell of Horus's many battles with Seth in order to avenge Seth's murder of Horus's father, Osiris. Egyptian pharaohs were often called the living Horus. Another temple that's mostly intact is at Edfu, 10 miles south of Nekhen, also dedicated to Horus. It was constructed between 237 and 57 BCE, during the reigns of Ptolemy III through the 12th. There are large statues near the entrance to the temple, placed there for the devotees of Horus, like this couple, who, by the way, have really enjoyed their visits to Egypt. Also at Edfu, there's a really nice bark replica in Horus's sanctuary. Behind the bark is the actual granite naos where the statue of the god was placed. An important scene in the Edfu temple is the depiction of Horus and Isis killing the god Set in the form of a hippopotamus. These figures were defaced by Christian zealots. Finally, let's head back up north to visit the temples at Medamud, Abydos, and Dendera. As mentioned before, the precinct of Montu, just north of Karnak, was originally connected to another temple dedicated to Montu, 3 miles northeast at Medamud. Excavated by the French, building construction has been revealed from the Old Kingdom through the Roman period. A statue of Montu with a Buchis Bull head was found in the temple, linking worship here with the Bushim at Armant. 100 miles north of Luxor is the famous temple at Abydos, built by Seti I in honor of his ancestors, the previous kings of Egypt. The temple contains cult chapels to Ptah, Ra-Harakti, Amun-Ra, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. This scene is from a chapel dedicated to Osiris. On the left, Seti I stands before the god Thoth, who holds the key of life to the nose of the deceased king. On the right, Seti stands before the god Horus. Seti I's temple at Abydos has a significant list of 76 Egyptian pharaohs, beginning with Menes, the first king of the first dynasty, and continuing up through Seti I and his son Ramses II. Behind Seti's temple, dug into the ground, is the Osirian, a weird structure that some Egyptologists think is a symbolic tomb for Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Adjacent to Seti's temple is another temple dedicated to Osiris, built by Ramses II, while he was co-ruler with his father. This temple still retains much of its original paint. Halfway back to Luxor is the temple dedicated to Hathor at Dendera. It was begun in the reign of Ptolemy VIII around 140 BCE and expanded upon until the reign of Tiberius in 37 CE. Hathor was an ancient goddess who had many attributes, including patron of love, romance, and motherhood. In the scene on the left, she is suckling the child god Ihi, and on the right, she is shown in her personification as a cow goddess, suckling the pharaoh and protecting the stars of the Milky Way. A map of the ancient Egyptian sky was originally inscribed on the ceiling of a chapel in the Dendera Temple. The position of the planets in a solar and lunar eclipse depicted on the relief dates it to around 50 BCE. The ceiling was moved to the Louvre Museum in France in 1821, and a replica shown here is now in its original place in the Dendera Temple. The temple was recently cleaned of its centuries of grime. Here's a spectacular view straight upwards between the columns. The details in original color are really fantastic. This is another temple that should not be missed. So in conclusion, the temples built by the ancient Egyptians commemorated their belief in the cycle of life, from birth to marriage to death, and finally resurrection. And there's no better place to explore their magnificent temples than Luxor, Egypt. Thank you. And here's my main sources of information for this talk. There's a lot more information available in these references,